So first of all, thank you very much for joining us and for being part of this. It's really a big honor for us.
Okay, my pleasure.
Please, can you tell us a little bit about your own background?
Well, my own background is I was born in Europe, in Romania, during the war. My father was Faltăceni Rav. He was a Rebbe in the town of Faltăceni. He was the rabbi of the city. And he was in a labor camp when I was born. And he was one of fortunate people who did come out of the labor camp. Most people did not survive labor camps. And when he did come out, he tried to get our family to Israel. We went on a boat to Israel. And when we got there, the British would not allow us to entrance to the land. They said their quota was full. And they sent our boat away, even though we told them nobody had any place to go. They obviously didn't care. So we went first to Greece, and then we went to Italy, and we were in Italy in refugee camp for a year and a half before we received papers to come to the United States. So I was a very little girl when I came to America, and that's my background. I married my husband, thank God, Rabbi Michael Twerski, who was American born. He was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And his father was Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael Twerski, who came here in 1927 from Russia, from Harnesteipel. He was my father-in-law, blessed memory, was the Harnesteipler Rebbe. And that's where my husband grew up here in America. He had gone to public school, and he is, and thank God, he and his brother, there were 5 sons. 2 are unfortunately gone, and 3, Baruch Hashem, are alive, and all fabulous young men. And that's it. And we moved to Milwaukee. And this is where we, Baruch Hashem, raised our family of 11 children. And Baruch Hashem, that's where we are now.
Baruch Hashem. We had a chance to catch up with one of the young brothers before, actually. We spoke to Rabbi Dr. Twerski a little bit before. So.
Right. He's my husband's older brother. Should live and be well. Right, he's in Eretz Yisrael, lives in Eretz Yisrael. And his twin brother, my husband has a twin brother, Rabbi Dr. Aaron Twerski, who's
there's 2 Rabbi Dr. Twerskis. That's
well,
confusing.
I don't know if he calls himself so much a doctor. He's a law professor.
Okay.
He's a law professor. Of course, all of them Hasidic Jews with the garb and the whole works. And of course, first and foremost, they're from Jews, they're rabbis, and then they each branched out into their specific calling, so to speak. My father, blessed memory, when we first came here, I came as a Kala, and there were very few from Jews here in Milwaukee at the time, and my father was introduced to Dr. Twerski, who was then in medical school becoming a doctor. And afterwards, he had a great sense of humor. My father had a great sense of humor. He said, my goodness gracious, if the doctors in Milwaukee look like this, with the Schrammel and the Bekasha, can you imagine what the ordinary people must look like here? So he was duly impressed. But Dr. Twerski mentioned a story at one time that he was doing his rounds in psychiatry in the hospital, and he had a patient who was put under for some kind of procedure, and when she woke up, he was standing over her. She hadn't met him before, and she was convinced that she had gone to the next world, and she was now meeting her maker. So she was
not the Jewish maker.
Yeah, the other, right, not the Jewish maker.
You settled in Milwaukee, and you've stayed there since, if I understand correctly.
Right, correct. Over, I don't know, 60 plus years probably.
And are not just a passive person on the ride, I understand. Very involved in the community and outreach work.
Yes,
Um,
Baruch Hashem.
can
Baruch
can you
Hashem, we have a community, a fabulous community here in Milwaukee. They basically, most of our community comes from a previous life, not a from life, and they've all made this journey and are absolutely unbelievable, accomplished, Jewishly accomplished people who now have children and grandchildren who are Rabbanim, who are into Kiruv, and who are doing Avodas HaKodesh, all of them. And then we've exported many of our Chevra as well. Many went on to move to Eretz Yisrael and in various parts of the country. So our non-biological family has expanded to all corners of the world, Baruch Hashem.
So clearly you have built an amazing infrastructure that you have there in Milwaukee. Have you ever thought about Aliyah for yourselves, or is it, what's your relationship like with coming to live in Israel?
All the time. And we actually tried to, now we spent a lot of time building our community in Milwaukee. And it took a lot of effort, a lot of fundraising to be able to put it all together. We actually looked, now we're older and we're not in a position to go fundraising, but what our dream would be to find somebody who would spearhead a program where we would find a location in Eretz Yisrael, where we would be able to take as many of our community who would be able to join us. And our dream would be to come to Eretz Yisrael, especially now. My husband is convinced that America, maybe the West, is terminally ill in terms of morals and values. Everything that all the new things. It happened first when the Supreme Court passed a law legalizing alternative marriages, and then it's gone from bad to worse in that area. And just now seeing everything that's happened with the riots, and of course it always ends up off of our skin. It's always the Jews' fault. Everything is the fault of the Jews. So it just seems like the world is heating up in terms of anti-Semitism to a point where we've had many from the Bima. My husband has encouraged people. They said that the only eight is to move to Eretz Yisrael. And when people call him on a personal level and they ask him advice whether they should look into it, he always tells them absolutely.
Do you feel that tension?
We don't really feel it like a moment to moment, except that when this pandemic broke out, my grandson, who now in Milwaukee, we have my husband, Zilzangizent, my son, Rabbi Ben Tion, should be well, and his son, Rabbi Chaim, who should be well, and his little kids. So we have 4 generations of Twerskis here in Milwaukee. Now, when the pandemic broke out, knowing that everything, no matter what it is, ends up being a Jewish issue, my grandson, who's in charge of all the logistics in the community, took our Sifrei Torah out of the Aron Kodesh and he hid them in people's basements. Wow. Because he was convinced that once they start like riots and stuff like that, they're going to be looking to vandalize shuls. And it has happened in other areas of the country. Thank God it hasn't happened here, but we can count on that. So it's a problem.
That's the second time I've met. My friend is a Rav in LA. He's an English guy, but he's a Rav in LA. And he told me that I was shocked to hear it. I mean, the thought of Jewish people taking the Sefer Torah out of shul to hide in a basement are stories that you assumed were consigned to some part of recent and even more distant history. If I told you it was happening in the United States of America, it's almost. I mean, if I would have said a year ago this was going to be happening, people wouldn't have believed it.
No, it is mind-boggling how fast history is moving, and not in a good direction, unfortunately.
So it's been done before. Communities and their Rabbanim have come on Aliyah. So that's the dream.
That's the dream. If you know anybody who's a good fundraiser and who could put together, find us a space in Eretz Yisrael where we can build a community there, bring our community, that would be a dream come true.
So keep an eye on the Hakshiva fundraiser. Let's see if it goes well. Maybe you'll bring the team in.
Okay.
What would you say, in your mind, are some of the unique challenges that face, I guess, teenagers in general nowadays, and maybe specifically some of them in Israel in a community such as Ramat Bet Shemesh?
Well, it's interesting that we were in Ramat Beit Shemesh for a number of years. When in consecutive years, we went to Rabbi Haber Shul, and we were scholars and residents there. And while we were there, we counseled, and many of the families you speak of came to counsel with us. And invariably, the issues they brought up were issues with their children. And there was the adjustment for their children when they made Aliyah was really traumatic in many instances. And they would go through all of the problems they had. But at the conclusion of telling us all that, and we did whatever we could to try to alleviate some of them, however, their concluding comment was, even though it's so difficult, and it's been a really, really problematic transition, we still are much happier being in Eretz Yisrael and being back in America or England or wherever they came from. So it's not without a difficulty. And children, when you uproot them, when they're used to a certain way of life and you take them out of that context and you bring them to a strange environment, invariably there are going to be problems. It's not to say there wouldn't have been problems wherever they came from, but certainly when you do that, there are many problems. That's why your work in Hakshiva is so important to get the young people acclimated. I mean, not to speak, some of the problems are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And most of it is because of technology. Today, access to internet and unfiltered internet and all kinds of social media has wreaked havoc in the lives of our young people. I often think that, thank God, that neither I nor my children grew up at a time when social media was so prevalent like it is today. It's just almost too powerful to resist. It is so compelling and draws these young people in such a way. Even early on, I remember that when video games came out. So we have a son-in-law, Zechron Levracha. Our son-in-law was killed in a bus accident. Now it's Rabbi Geltzeler. He was a Rosh Yeshiva and had a really phenomenal a connection with his students and very unique. In any case, when the video games came out, and they were pretty innocent, all you had to do was play a game over there, whatever. He would not allow it into his house. And he was a very open-minded person. And they asked him, Taylor, why? Why don't you let your children play with this? He said, it's not that inherently there's anything wrong with this particular video game, but there's no way that a black Gemara can compete with a video game. When you put in front of a youngster a video game and a black Gemara, we know which they're going to choose.
Yeah.
So it's very, and of course, with the way it's gotten to be today, where it's so luring and so enchanting for young people, it's a real major problem.
And the irony that they call it social media, and it's the most anti-social.
That's right.
Yeah,
it's true. It's so true, because today people don't talk to each other. It's everything is through media. It's really, it's a chaval.
Everyone was a teenager once. For Rebbitzen, I see it wasn't long ago. But when you were a teenager, do you have like maybe a funny or a classic teenager story that you can share with us that maybe shows that in some way teenagers haven't changed and in other ways they've changed a lot?
At that time, for me, today it's social media for young people. At that time, of course, wasn't an issue. There was none of that, but I had books. I was a voracious reader. Everything. And at that time, the classics were not off limit. And Beis Yaakov at that time, it wasn't treif. And I used to, any opportunity I would get, I would be reading a book. And my father's, like I said, had a fabulous sense of humor. He was a Rebbe. but he understood. He understood me, he loved me and whatever, and he appreciated who I was. And he would come into my little room where I would be hiding out anywhere, under the covers in the closet, just reading my books. And he would come in and he would start singing Al HaTorah V'Al HaAvodah, just to start, just appreciating the fact that any moment I would get, I would be busy reading. And, I appreciate the fact that I was involved in that at the time, because it gave me skills that I can use today.
That some societies nowadays, and as you pointed out just now, that in those days it wasn't treif. Nowadays things have become so rigid, so many communities, and so kind of parallel bars, and nothing deviates.
Right.
Where does that leave like teenagers nowadays? Because you said that was your outlet, books, but it is the nature of that period of life often that you do you don't push the boundaries for any terrible, sinister reason. It's just you're expanding your horizons. And if you are in a very rigid place, and people make, let's say, aliyah into a community such as that, do you feel that maybe is one of the causes? I mean, you say you were counseling in Rat Shemesh, and did you see common themes maybe coming through with some of the people and what they were facing?
Well, I don't know if it's the rigidity and defense of rigidity, where I see it in many of the communities that I'm familiar with out in New York. People are desperate to safeguard what they have. They're so frightened of what they see out there, like the youngsters that you get into your Hakshiva programs, where the world out there is so noxious and so pernicious, and they're trying so desperately to hang on with to what they have. I don't know that parents have to everything, not one size fits all. Everybody needs to know their child. You need to know what you can say no to. You have to choose your battles. You have to, like they say, is this the hill you want to die on? It's not like you can say outright, absolutely, don't let your children have access to social media. Put maybe a filter, some restrictions, time of day, and whatever would work for the child. If you don't give children some sort of leeway in some instances, they will find a way to do it without you knowing about it. So in some instances, it's much better to have an open conversation and say, how can we have a meeting of the minds? I'm not happy with you being involved in this morning, noon, night, so can we put some boundaries here? What would work for you, and let's see what would work for us, and let's see how that works. So I think that people like yourself who are dealing with this, and I'm sure in Hakshiva they do this, a child comes in, a youngster comes in, and you see who you're dealing with. People are so different. For one child, you can really have them toe the line as you would wish, and for others, you have to make accommodations for who they are. So it takes chachma, it takes wisdom, it takes more than anything else, siyata d'shmaya. And parents I always tell them, they come for advice and counsel. I said, first of all, take out your tehillim and say tehillim. Tehillim, 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 and daven to the Rabbanu Shalom. And one of the other very potent forces is shalom bayis. Youngsters that grow up in an environment of shalom bayis, I don't know if it was a Panovich or one of the greats, they asked him how to raise good children. He said it's 50% tefillas, davening, and it's 50% shalom bayis. If children grow up in an environment where they see respect between parents, they get such a sense of security, such a feeling that they're going to be okay. There's somebody who's going to take care of them. There's something in life they can count on. It's an anchor for them. It's an anchor. So I think first, I always tell parents who come to counsel, how is your shalom bayis? I ask them, work on your shalom bayis, and let your children grow up in that kind of an environment, and then daven and daven and daven, and then when you're done with all that, then you counsel with people who are more expert in the field and ask them what they would advise in your particular unique situation.
At this time, one of the things that's been missing for many people is community and the ability to be together. And that, so even people who are socially connected in a more healthy way have found this a big challenge. How do you feel it's impacting on community life and maybe even your own working routine?
Well, you know what? It's had its advantages and disadvantages. There have been more classes, more teaching than ever before, because you can get on Zoom. People don't have to leave their homes. I have been teaching, my husband has been teaching, my son, my grandson, and people are very eager because you can also see other people who have, joined in the class. So you have, besides the learning that's done, you also connect with other people. So that's been a wonderful opportunity. Classes here in our schools have also taken place on Zoom. And of course, obviously, children miss that social interaction. There's no question about it. But I spoke to one of the high schools here. I said to them, this is such a rare opportunity. You know, if you take this opportunity to handle it in a positive way, in other words, not to rail against your terrible situation. All the other classes previously went on trips and they did all these other things. But if you would stop to think and say to yourself, you know, how can I make of this a situation where I could tell my grandchildren, my grandchildren, they'll be sitting around me, and I'll say to them, you know, children, come and let me tell you about when I grew up. When I grew up, like today, grandparents will tell their children, you know, I walked 3 miles to school in the freezing cold and whatever, and we can't relate to it so much, but we like to hear those stories. I said, in the future, your grandchildren, great-grandchildren will sit around and you'll tell them, you know, there was a time when we couldn't go to school, and we had to do this on a computer, and still we made the best of it, and and it was a wonderful time. So you're teaching them. It's a teaching opportunity, because it's also a teaching opportunity. And I tell this to parents. Parents always ask me, how do I teach my children to cope? I say to them, coping skills are transmitted only one way, and that is when they observe you coping. Speeches won't do. You can't tell your children, you know, this is what you do under circumstances that are less than desirable. They watch you carefully. How are you coping? How are you taking all this? And if we choose to see the positive in whatever it is we're experiencing, our children are watching very carefully. And we're teaching them very valuable lesson. So I think that's what we need to do. Keep reminding ourselves, you know, I won't have this opportunity. I don't want to blow this. Let me show my children that this is okay. We could sit down. I never had time before when I ran off to work to sit down and play a game with them, to sit down and talk to them. And now we have this opportunity. So make something good out of it while it's here.
What do you think is what is the most original and fun thing that you've maybe managed to achieve during the Corona time?
You know, we had a minyan first before now, Baruch Hashem, they went back to shul, of course, with distancing and such. But we had a minyan in our backyard. And our son, Rabbi Ben Zion, he put out the most stunning and beautiful plants in our backyard. It was mamish like Gan Eden out there. You're separated from the whole world. You come out there, and I'm sure that the davening had a different kind of taste when you're in the midst of such beautiful nature. Marabu Ma'asecha Hashem, and lots of people, when they decide to go back to shul, were disappointed. You know, like, here, finally, you've made it. You go back to shul. Oh, but we loved it out there. You know, to be in the midst of nature, and it was such a wonderful thing. So that was really, it was wonderful. It was enhancing the davening. It didn't detract, it was enhancing.
So there's that point again. You were faced with adversity, and Minyana weren't normal, and instead your son took the opportunity to make something original out of it. How would you suggest or think that maybe Hakshiva could be part of helping to alleviate some of these tensions and pressures that face families and teenagers nowadays, particularly maybe right now during this current crisis?
Well, it's a situation like this can bring families closer together or can tear them apart. And, and I've seen this, some are complaining about having to be together with their spouse 24/7, and others are welcoming the opportunity. Instead of rushing off to work, all of a sudden they calm down, they're able to look at their spouse, they're able to look at their children and get reacquainted again. The rush of life, the fast, the frenzied pace has calmed down. And we did have to adjust to it because we weren't used. People, kind of distract themselves with busyness. And now there was no busyness. It's time to sit down and figure out, like, who am I? When you take away all that busyness, what's left? What do I believe? What do I like doing? How is my avodas Hashem? What's my connection to the Ribono Shel Olam? People distract themselves to a point where they never think about that. One day chases the next. And here there's an opportunity to confront those issues. And it's really a wonderful opportunity. At the same time, it's also challenging. Now, when it comes to relationships, families have to figure out how, even in the midst of being thrown together as they are, like one of the Indian philosophers said, let there be spaces in your togetherness. Togetherness is wonderful, but everybody needs a little space in the togetherness. So people have to figure out by themselves, how is it that I can have some space in this togetherness? So it doesn't get onerous, it doesn't get too much of a, heavy, it doesn't get too heavy. So, but it's really I think the biggest opportunity here is for a person to confront themselves and ask themselves, look in the mirror and say, who's this person? What drives me? Was it my work? Was it relationships? But bottom line is, I have to figure out who I am. And when we do go back, when this is over, when we go back, hopefully the insights we glean from that question, that self-evaluation, will accompany us to the point where we're not going to go back to that crazy, frenzied existence, that will take whatever insights that we've gleaned with us into life when and if it ever goes back to normal. Well, I think it's a wonderful thing. If you save one child, you save an entire world. A person is an olam katan. Every person's an olam katan. So if Hakshiva manages to get one young person back on track, or one adult back on track, I think that the key is to listen without bias and without preconceived notions. Because oftentimes when we talk to somebody, we already figure out what they're going to say before they even say it. And that's not giving that person, a covered. It's not really, we have to make our minds totally blank and be open to whatever is going to come. And have a conversation with them based on what they are offering us, and evaluate the situation and give counsel according to what it is that they are telling us, not according to what we're thinking. The key to everything is getting ourselves out of our heads and out of the way. When we get ourselves out of the way in every interaction with other human beings, we can be effective. So long as we're right there, the I is right there, then we can't really have an interaction or a relationship with another person that's really valid, because it's me coloring everything, and it's not that I'm not really listening to the other person.
So to listen and be there for the person in the way that they do, I guess that's a very beautiful way to end. That's why they call themselves Hakshiva, that they're there.
Hakshiva, to focus on another individual, get myself out of the way and focus on the other person. And then what's really, really amazing, and we've seen that in counseling over these many years we've counseled, is that when you get yourself out of the way, you allow the wisdom of the Rebbeinu Shalom to inform your interaction with the other person. Only when you get yourself out of the way. If we're in the way, the Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't join us. It's only when we get out of the way that we can have that siyata d'shmaya. And we've seen this so many times. So many times I said to my husband, or he said to me, I was talking to this person and I listened to the words that came out of my mouth. I didn't even know I knew that. I didn't know where it came from. It definitely came from a higher source. But that's because we got ourselves out of the way.
Rebbitzen, it has been such an honor to speak to you. I have to be honest, I didn't actually know very much about Rebbitzen Twerski. I was told, oh, you've got to speak to her. And it's been such a privilege to speak to such a grounded and rounded person. I really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you. And tzlacha rabba in the work that you do. And you should be able to give all of these people that you interact with some direction and the support and everything that you're looking to do. Rebbeinu Shalom should help you in everything that you do.
Amen. Thank you, Rebbitzen. Thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Be well and continue to have tzlacha and good health.
Amen. Amen. Thank you.